Imagine fighting side by side with someone for years, hiding together, running together, risking your life together, only to wake up one morning and hear that the people you trusted most have signed a deal you never agreed to. Not a small deal. A deal that changes what you fought for. And suddenly, the question isn't, how do we beat the enemy? It's, who betrayed us? That is why, more than a century later, one of the most powerful words in Irish history is still the most dangerous: betrayal. Because in Ireland, there is an event that didn't just end a war, it split a nation, turned comrades into enemies, and lit the fuse for a civil war that left a bitterness so deep it still echoes in politics, in families, and in memory. Today, we're going to walk straight into that moment. Not with slogans. Not with propaganda. But with the pressure, the fear, and the impossible choices that created what many call the worst betrayal in Irish history. And by the end, you may still disagree with what happened. But you'll understand exactly why people still fight over it. It begins with a country exhausted by violence. By the early 1920s, Ireland wasn't just arguing about independence, it was living it in the harshest way possible. The War of Independence had dragged ordinary people into extraordinary danger. Night raids. Ambushes. Informers. Arrests. Burned buildings. Families watching the road, waiting to hear if a son or brother would come home. On paper, it was a conflict between the British state and Irish revolutionaries. On the ground, it felt like a society being tightened in a fist. And in that atmosphere, the Irish Republican Army was fighting a campaign that depended on secrecy and loyalty. You didn't just need courage, you needed trust. Trust that the man beside you wouldn't talk. Trust that the house you slept in wouldn't betray you. Trust that the leadership aimed for the same goal you were risking everything for. That goal, in the minds of many, wasn't complicated. A republic. Not a compromise. Not a stepping stone. Not a version of freedom with a crown still hovering over it. A full Irish republic. But history rarely gives people clean options, especially when empires are involved. By 1921, the fighting had reached a point where everyone felt the strain. Britain wanted stability. Ireland wanted freedom. And both sides knew something uncomfortable: neither could easily crush the other without paying a price that might be too high. So negotiations were offered. And that is where the betrayal story begins, not in a gunfight, but in a room. Because the kind of betrayal that haunts nations doesn't always look like a knife in the back. Sometimes it looks like a pen. When talks were arranged, the Irish leadership faced a question that would define everything: who should be sent to negotiate? This was not a detail. It was destiny. The men chosen to go were not minor figures. They were some of the most recognized faces of the struggle, men whose names carried weight with the public, and whose decisions would be seen as the decisions of Ireland itself. Michael Collins went. Arthur Griffith went. Others joined them. But there was a shadow over the delegation. Eamon de Valera, the most prominent political leader of the revolutionary movement, did not go to London himself. Some would say that was wise. Others would say it was fatal. Because it meant that the people in the room, under pressure, under deadlines, under the intense political power of the British state, would carry the burden alone. Now, imagine what that room felt like. On one side, the representatives of an empire that had ruled Ireland for centuries, an empire that knew how to negotiate from strength, and knew how to apply pressure without always saying the threat out loud. On the other side, men carrying the hopes of a revolution and the grief of a war, trying to translate sacrifice into a document. What could Ireland realistically get? That was the question. And the British were not offering a republic. They were offering something else. Dominion status. That phrase sounds technical, almost boring, but it was explosive. Dominion status meant Ireland would have its own government, its own institutions, a high degree of internal independence. But still within the British Commonwealth, with the British monarch as head of state. To many Irish Republicans, that was not freedom. That was a cage with a larger yard. Then came the oath. Not just a political oath. A symbolic one. An oath of allegiance that tied the new Irish state, in some form, to the British crown. Again, to some people, that might sound like paperwork. But in revolutions, symbols are not decorations. Symbols are the soul of the fight. People had died for the idea that Ireland belonged to itself. So how do you tell the families of the dead that the new Ireland must swear anything at all to the very institution they rebelled against? And then there was the issue that would poison the future no matter what: partition. Northern Ireland, 6 counties, would remain separate, with provisions that made reunification possible only under certain conditions, conditions that many suspected would never arrive. For those who dreamed of one Ireland, partition felt like a wound deliberately left open. So you had a deal that offered partial independence, demanded symbolic submission, and accepted a divided island. And now the negotiators had to decide: do we reject this, continue the war, and gamble everything? Or do we accept it, take what we can, and hope to build more later? People today argue with the comfort of hindsight, as if the answer should have been obvious. But inside that moment, it wasn't. Because the British had one other weapon: the threat of resumed war on a scale Ireland might not survive. The negotiators were under intense pressure. Deadlines. Ultimatums. The constant reminder that if they walked away, the violence could return, and return worse. So when the document was finally placed on the table, it wasn't presented like a mutual agreement between equals. It was presented like a doorway that could slam shut forever. And then, after arguments, after sleepless nights, after wrestling with their consciences, some of the Irish delegates signed. They signed the Anglo-Irish Treaty in December 1921. The moment the ink dried, Ireland changed. Because now there were 2 Irelands. Not geographically, but emotionally. 2 visions of what the struggle meant. On one side were those who saw the treaty as a disaster. They called it betrayal. They said it abandoned the republic that had been declared. They said it forced Irish leaders to swear allegiance to a foreign crown. They said it accepted partition. They said it turned a revolution into a compromise. To them, it wasn't a stepping stone. It was surrender dressed up as progress. On the other side were those who saw the treaty as a lifeline. They argued that it created an Irish Free State with real power, real institutions, and real control over much of the country. They claimed it was the first time in centuries that Ireland would govern itself in a meaningful way. They argued that it wasn't the end of the journey, but the beginning. Michael Collins famously framed it as the freedom to achieve freedom. And that line still burns. Because to critics, it sounded like an excuse. To supporters, it sounded like strategy. But no matter which side you're on, here's what makes this the worst betrayal in Irish history. It wasn't just a disagreement over policy. It was a fracture in trust. The revolutionary movement had been held together by faith that everyone was fighting for the same destination. Now the destination was disputed. And once that happened, the language changed fast. People stopped saying, "our side." They started saying, "traitor." The treaty had to be debated and ratified. And the debates were not calm. They were raw, furious, and personal. Because each side believed it was defending the honor of the dead. Each side believed the other side was endangering the living. And when politics becomes a battle over who has the right to claim sacrifice, compromise becomes almost impossible. The vote passed, narrowly. The treaty was accepted. But acceptance on paper did not mean acceptance in the heart. And that is where the betrayal turned into tragedy. Because once the treaty became official, those who opposed it faced a brutal decision: accept a settlement they believed betrayed the republic, or resist it. Resistance didn't stay theoretical. The anti-treaty side believed they were defending the true Ireland. The pro-treaty side believed they were building a state and saving the country from chaos. And both sides had guns. The civil war that followed wasn't a war of strangers. It was a war of former comrades. Men who had once trusted each other with their lives now aimed rifles at each other. That's why it was so psychologically devastating. In many civil conflicts, people can tell themselves the enemy is different. Different language, different culture, different religion. Here, the enemy sounded like you. He used to fight beside you. He knew your methods, your networks, your weaknesses. And that makes a war crueler. Because it feels personal. What began as political rupture became violence. There were occupations, standoffs, and escalating attacks. And then the war hardened. Executions followed. Prisons filled. The bitterness deepened. The most shocking part is how fast the moral landscape flipped. A man could be a hero one month and a traitor the next, depending on which side you asked. And that kind of division doesn't disappear when the shooting stops. It sinks into the soil. Now, you might be thinking, if the treaty created a functioning Irish state, why is it still called betrayal at all? Because the argument isn't just about outcomes. It's about the meaning of the struggle. For treaty opponents, the Republic wasn't a bargaining chip. It was the promise that justified sacrifice. If you abandon the promise, what does that make the sacrifice? For treaty supporters, refusing the treaty risked endless war and suffering, and they would say, what kind of leadership chooses symbolic purity over the lives of real people? That's why people still fight over it. It's the oldest conflict in politics. Principle versus pragmatism. Purity versus survival. But in Ireland, it's amplified by memory. Because the treaty split became more than a moment. It became the root of political identities, loyalties, and parties for generations. Even if modern voters don't recite the treaty clauses, the cultural echo remains. People inherited opinions like family heirlooms. Some grew up hearing, they sold us out. Others grew up hearing, they saved us. And the deeper reason it never fully settled is this. Both sides can point to evidence that they were right. Supporters can say, the treaty led to a state that gradually became more independent, eventually removing many ties to Britain. Institutions grew. Sovereignty expanded over time. A path was carved. Opponents can say, the treaty accepted partition, it undermined the declared republic, and it forced an oath that symbolically chained Irish leaders to the crown. It normalized compromise where they believed no compromise was morally acceptable. So which side is correct? Here's the twist that makes this story so haunting. The question, who betrayed Ireland, might be the wrong question. Because betrayal depends on what you believe Ireland was owed. If you believe the goal was a pure republic, then signing anything less is betrayal. If you believe the goal was to stop suffering and secure real power, then refusing a workable deal could be seen as betrayal of the people. And if you step back further, you could argue the biggest betrayal of all was the situation itself, an empire creating conditions where Ireland had to choose between incomplete freedom and more blood. In that sense, the treaty wasn't just a document. It was a mirror. It reflected Ireland's deepest tension, the desire to be uncompromisingly itself, and the need to survive in a world controlled by powerful forces. That's why the treaty split still sparks arguments. Because it forces people to answer a painful question. What is freedom worth? Is freedom worth compromise if compromise keeps people alive? Or is compromise the death of freedom itself? And people answer that based on their values, their family stories, and their sense of honor. Now let's look at Michael Collins for a moment, because he sits at the center of this storm. To supporters, Collins was a realist who understood that revolutions are not finished in one step. That you take ground, consolidate, and push forward later. To critics, Collins became the face of compromise, the man who signed away the Republic. What makes him tragic is that he seemed to understand the danger. He knew the treaty would split Ireland. He knew men would call him a traitor. And he also knew that rejecting the treaty could mean catastrophic war with Britain, where Ireland might lose. So whatever you think of him, he wasn't playing a game. He was choosing between nightmares. And that's the key to this story that often gets lost in modern debates. The people involved were not cartoon villains. Many were patriots who simply believed different things about strategy and morality. The civil war that followed was not proof that one side was evil. It was proof that the treaty created a moral fracture so sharp it cut through comradeship. And that's why this is remembered as the worst betrayal. Because it wasn't one person selling out another. It was a nation forced into a choice where unity couldn't survive. Even after the war ended, the emotional damage remained. Families carried trauma. Communities carried grudges. Politics formed around the split. And in historical memory, the question never completely died. Was it betrayal? Or was it rescue? Now, if you're listening and thinking, okay, But give me the final answer, was it the worst betrayal or not? Here's the honest answer. It became the worst betrayal in Irish history because people believed it was. History isn't only made by facts. It's made by how people feel about facts. And the treaty created a feeling so intense that it turned neighbors into enemies. That's what makes it different from other betrayals: informers, backroom deals, personal treachery. Those betray individuals. This one betrayed the dream of unity. Whether you see the treaty as necessary or unforgivable, it created a split so deep that Irish people spent generations arguing about what the revolution was for. And if a single decision can do that, if it can make a nation fight itself, not just in 1 year but in memory for a century, then it earns its place as one of the most devastating betrayals in Irish history. So I'll leave you with the same question Ireland has wrestled with since 1921. Was the treaty a betrayal of the Republic? Or was it the only doorway to freedom that existed in that moment? Write your answer in the comments, but don't just say yes or no. Tell me why. And if you want more Irish history explained like a documentary, stories where one decision changes everything, subscribe, because the next one will go even deeper into the moments that still shape who we are today.